back into the world of Windows handhelds, and this is an interesting one since last year I covered MSI's first venture into the world of Windows-based handhelds to mixed results, but the Claw returns. And this time around it's packing Intel's Lunar Lake, which is their second generation Core Ultra processor, and specifically for the Claw, the 258V, which will be the first time that we talk about this chipset on the channel, and it promises to bring quite a significant upgrade over Meteor Lake. MSI is launching not one, but two different variants of the Claw, with a new 8-inch model as well as this refreshed 7-inch model, which has some refinements both on the outside and under the hood. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we reunite with the Claw and the Core Ultra and find out if this second generation has what it takes to claw back into the handheld space. As we always do, let's talk specs, pricing, do a quick unboxing, and tour around the new MSI Claw 7 AI Plus, which ships with this cardboard box that isn't quite as nice as the first generation, but a box is a box, and what matters is what's under the hood. And this time around, the Claw ships with Intel's Lunar Lake Core Ultra 7 258V, which is an 8-core, 8-thread processor that features 4 performance cores and 4 low-power efficient cores with frequencies up to 4.8 GHz. And the Intel Arc Graphics 140V, which should provide quite a significant upgrade over the Meteor Lake Arc Graphics, and it's very much welcome since the Claw sees the return of its excellent 7-inch IPS display with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 that supports 120Hz VRR and tops out at a max 500 nits of brightness. As I mentioned earlier, the Claw does ship in 2 variants, but specifically for this 7-inch model, MSI is only offering one configuration as of right now, which ships with 32GB of LPDDR5X RAM and 512GB of internal NVMe storage, which can be upgraded using the M.2 2230 slot, as well as storage expansion with a microSD slot. The Claw now features 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports with support for Power Delivery 3.0, as well as Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.3, and a 3.5mm headset port, and is powered by a 54.5 Wh battery with fast charge support. And in the box we do have an included USB-C 65W power adapter to support the fast charging capabilities, as well as the MSI Quick Guide and a Claw Startup Guide, which prepares you for what to expect when you first power on the device. And yes, there will be plenty of Windows updates out of the box, which the Claw does ship with Windows 11 Home out of the box. The Claw 7 AI Plus should be available for purchase by the time this video publishes, direct from MSI's website, as well as online at places like Amazon.com for $799 for the configuration that I have in hand, which, as I've said, is the only one currently available. I'd like to thank MSI for loaning this Claw in advance of the release so that I can spend quality time with it and put together this in-depth video of the device. As I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's take a tour around the device as well as a close look at the controls. Starting out at the top right, we have the stacked shoulder button configuration, and MSI went back and redesigned the shoulder buttons here, coming from the first generation Claw. Now oddly enough, as I've used the new Claw, I find myself missing the quieter shoulder buttons of the first gen model, which for many, including myself, was a point of contention since they were quite mushy, but they were incredibly quiet, especially in comparison to the new shoulder buttons here on the A2VM, which are very audible, and for those that might game in bed like I do, I've definitely worried about waking up the Retro Tech mommy. Now, the action of the shoulder button is improved, and it is easier to press and definitely not mushy like the first gen model. I can press down easily regardless of where my finger rests. And below that we have the Hall Effect shoulder trigger, which does feel the same as the first generation, and for me personally, I never really had any issues with the triggers here that have a nice smooth movement as well as solid range. Unfortunately, similar to the buttons, the triggers are surprisingly noisy when pressing down on them fully, and it was something that stood out to me when I was doing my testing. So let's move across the top of the device, and here we have access to the volume up and down buttons, the 3.5mm headset port, some nice and subtle Claw branding, as well as the 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which is a very nice and welcome addition coming from the first generation, which only had a single port. And the 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports greatly expand the functionality here with the ability to charge and connect to an external display, external GPU, or even have 2 displays running at the same time that really turns the Claw into a mini PC of sorts. We do also have access to the microSD slot for storage expansion, and finally the power button with the built-in fingerprint sensor for security. On the left side we have the shoulder button and trigger that feel and function the same as the ones on the right. Now moving down the left side of the device, we can really appreciate its curves and see part of the built-in grips on the Claw 7, which like the first gen model is still very much a highlight here, since it really does add to the overall comfort of the handheld. Now at the bottom and on the right side, we have no additional inputs to speak of. So let's take a look at the back side, and probably the most noticeable thing here is the massive intake vent on the back, which is actually identical to the first gen model with the MSI logo at the center and the programmable buttons on each side. These are also quite audible, but I actually find their placement to be very good since they're easy to reach and press down on. Now going to the front, let's talk about the rest of the controls, starting at the top left with the return of the Hall Effect analog stick, which I thought were very good with the first gen, and likewise are very solid here, with excellent range and movement like found on a standard controller. MSI did go back and redesign the analog stick cap, which is much improved here, and with the nice texturing around the ring as well as the concave center, it really gives your thumbs a solid grip, and unlike the original Claw, my thumbs don't slide off these. This is definitely a welcome improvement. Now below the analog stick, we have the D-pad, and likewise this has also undergone a cosmetic change, but the functionality is the same, for better or worse, and what MSI has done here is actually raise the edges on the plastic of each direction, so that your thumb has a better sense of location on the D-pad. Now for me personally, this isn't the best thing since the edges of those raised portions are a bit harsh, and if you roll your thumb a lot like I do when using a D-pad, it's not the greatest feeling. Now the D-pad was never really a highlight for me on the original model, and to be fair, for my own use cases, the Claw was always a stick-first device, but I do wish that MSI did more than just a cosmetic change for this D-pad, which is really just serviceable in terms of usability. The D-pad itself doesn't have much movement or a defined pivot, and you can see that when I press down in the center and roll my thumb. So next to the display on both the left and right sides, we have the select and start buttons as well as the dedicated buttons for the MSI Center and the quick access overlay. These are fairly quiet to press down on and are identical to what we saw on the original Claw. Moving to the right side, we have the 4 face buttons in the Xbox style ABXY configuration, and these are nice and large buttons that are nearly identical in size to an Xbox Series controller. They are a bit audible, but even when compared to an Xbox Series controller for example, they are quieter. The buttons have a nice amount of travel, they don't scrape against the shell, and they do sit slightly above the face of the device when they are fully pressed down. I really like these buttons. I think they are solid and high quality with an awesome transparent plastic that allows the RGB lights to shine through them. This is actually a returning design from the original Claw, and I really don't have much complaints with this design. And of course below that we have the second Hall Effect analog stick. Now at the center of it all, quite literally, is the returning 7-inch IPS panel that supports a nice 1920 by 1080 resolution with support for 120Hz variable refresh rate, and honestly it was a solid panel over on the original Claw, and likewise it remains the same here. The color reproduction is quite good, and that VRR is very useful for smoother gameplay. The viewing angles are excellent, and my display has really no backlight bleeding to speak of, and the brightness is also solid with a top end of 500 nits, and scales down as needed for dark environments. Now the display isn't the brightest I've used, but it's still quite visible even here in Arizona where the sun seemingly is trying to kill me, much like it was in Super Mario Bros. 3. Just like on the first generation Claw, the display remains an excellent part of this overall unit. Now speaking of excellent parts of the first generation Claw, the audio experience here remains absolutely top notch. But MSI was not content with the speakers and they went back and actually improved them further, which they showcased back in December during an MSI event, and while we lose the Nahimic audio partnership on the softer side, these speakers hardware wise are better than ever, and I'm absolutely blown away at times at just how good they are, especially when combined with the excellent vibration motors that make this feel very much like a home theater experience in your hands. Seriously, these are some of the best speakers in a handheld, and I have used a lot of them, so let's take a quick listen.
Got another blackout in Santo Domingo. Netrunners are at it again, poking holes in the power grid. While over in Westbrook, trauma teams scraping cyber-psycho victims off the
And really just speaking overall, just like the first gen, I always felt that the Claw was a solid built device, and of course much of that remains the same here with some improvements like the analog stick caps. The plastics here are solid, the black doesn't really pick up on the fingerprints, and overall it's a nicely built device with nice touches to make it feel a bit more premium. And most importantly, it's a very comfortable handheld to hold, and it remains the same story for the Claw 7 specifically. The way the front of the plastic angles down to let your palms rest when gripping the device, as well as the solid grips on the back with the placement of the sticks and buttons, make this one of the better devices ergonomically on the market. And what's exciting here is that MSI as well as Intel definitely have been working behind the scenes to make the overall experience better, both in terms of the power that backs the new Claw, as well as the software experience. The MSI Center M has been massively improved on since we first saw the launch of the Claw last year, and while it's not perfect and is still missing a few features that I'd like to see incorporated, it's come a long way from what we had with the first generation. The best part is that these new features have been brought over to their first gen devices, so for those owners, they can actually go back and enjoy the work that MSI has put into the Center M. Now with the tap of the dedicated button to the left of the display, the MSI Center M will come up, and from here it acts as a launcher to start your games, as well as tweak some of the performance settings. For example, in the user scenario section, we can actually switch to the AI engine, endurance, or use the manual option to set 3 different TDP presets at either 8 watts, 17 watts, or 30 watts, with the ability to adjust the fan curves as well. Now I'm happy that we can adjust as low as 8 watts, which was not possible on the first gen Claw, and the minimum on that handheld was set to 20 watts, if that's any indication of what we can expect here with Lunar Lake. Now, I'd love to see MSI add the ability to adjust on a per watt increment, similar to other brands, and I do understand their goal of keeping it as simple as possible. But there are definitely cases where I'd love to just set the device to 10 watts, for example, and I do hope that MSI will consider this in the future. Now from here, we can also do things like scan for any updates that might be available for the Claw, and then of course there are other settings like adjusting the RGB lighting, tweaking the AI engine preset, and so it really does act as an all-in-one hub for the Claw. This has mostly remained the same experience on the Claw since it first launched. But let's now tap on the dedicated quick access button for the MSI Center overlay. And this is where we see quite the change. This overlay is pretty slick, and it provides, as its name suggests, the ability to quickly change common settings on the fly, and so the typical things like brightness, volume, and even a real-time stat monitor, and of course the ability to switch to performance presets are all present here. Now, I did mention that there are definitely things that can be built on here. For example, there's no way to change to TDP presets when on manual here, and so you'd still need to go into the MSI Center M software to make that adjustment. But there are some other surprises here with this new overlay, since it actually has integration with the Xbox Game Bar, and so we have a lot of the features from the Game Bar built into this overlay, like your Xbox Friends list on one tab, or other Xbox Game Bar features like the in-game recording and performance statistics. This integration is pretty awesome and quite seamless, and again, these are all great changes that make the experience much better with the Claw as a handheld device. And I'm excited to see MSI continue to iterate on their software, which has a lot of potential. Alright, so before we dive into the numbers, let's dive into the hardware and see what's going on under the hood of this new MSI Claw. And this will be more of a mini teardown, since the goal for this is to observe the battery as well as take a look at the accessibility of the internal storage in the event that you might want to upgrade to a larger capacity drive. So let's turn the Claw over, and we do have 6 Phillips screws that are visible here in the back plate. I'll go ahead and grab a Phillips size 00 bit from my trusty iFixit kit to get these screws removed quickly. 5 out of these 6 screws will be completely removable, but that final screw in the middle at the bottom will remain in the shell, which is actually by design. With all the screws removed and loose, it's time to figure out the best way to gain access to the Claw. By the way, I'll make a quick note that the screws used to secure the backplate are fairly long and clearly designed to secure across the entirety of the width of the handheld, which definitely makes things nice and secure here. Okay, so back to popping this cover off, and typically I like to start out somewhere at the top of the shell, but during my poking and prodding, I found that actually the best way to gain access is to separate the shell at the bottom with something like a pick. I always hope that these are helpful so that you know what not to do, and I will say that the top is not the ideal way to get that separation, since there are numerous tabs that can easily break if you're not careful. So again, just go slowly, but start at the bottom of the Claw, and you can see that it does pop off pretty easily this way. So looking closer at this backplate, we get a nice look at the screen in place to help minimize the amount of dust that gets pulled in through these intakes at the back of the Claw. Alright, and then we've now got a nice and centered look at the back of the Claw without that cover on, and 2 things definitely stand out to me here, which is the battery that takes up a good portion of the device, much like it did on the first gen Claw, as well as those 2 sizable fans and heatsink at the center to keep things nice and cool here. But most importantly, we have a huge change coming from the first generation Claw, and that is the ability to easily swap out the included NVMe drive for a larger capacity drive. This is such a nice and welcome change, since the process to do the same thing was much more involved on the original Claw, which had you removing the fans and heatsink to gain access to the storage. Now just looking around, I will say that the Claw has some sizable vibration motors, which probably explains why it's quite good here on this device, as well as those excellent speakers, which MSI went back and improved on from the first generation, which on a hardware level were already fantastic. And again, like I mentioned, I got to see this process during a private MSI event back in December. And it does look like we have the same battery returning from the original Claw, which again has a capacity of 54.5 watt hours, and like the original model, can easily be disconnected right in the middle here, making a battery swap or servicing the battery a fairly easy task. It does look like the controls are on its separate daughter boards, which again makes servicing the controls an easy task since they are not part of the main board. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the daughter board for the right side, which houses the face buttons, and this is held into place with 4 screws. And you can continue to use the same size bit to service this. As always, make sure to disconnect all 3 of the cables here. Now with all the screws and cables disconnected, let's go ahead and pop this entire assembly out, which has the Hall effect analog stick and the shoulder trigger as part of that daughter board. One thing I wanted to point out is the small touches here for the components. For example, the cable here has glue placed into the connector to prevent any accidental tears that can potentially happen when pulling on the cable. It's something that you don't see much of, and I just thought it was a nice little touch. And with the board out of the way, let's just quickly look at how these face buttons, which unsurprisingly are uniquely keyed, so there won't be any easy swapping if you prefer that Nintendo style layout. These are definitely really nice quality face buttons that are quite substantial. Now looking back at the daughter board, we can see the membrane used here for the face buttons, as well as the Hall effect analog stick, which does appear to be a soldered component. And so I think I've satisfied my curiosity here and accomplished the 2 key goals with this small teardown, which was to gain access to the battery area as well as examine the ability to swap out that NVMe storage. And now I think we've become quite acquainted with the hardware. Let's crunch some numbers, and since we are dealing with a fairly new chipset that is making an appearance for the first time in a handheld device in both the MSI Claw 7 and 8 A2VM models, as well as the first time that I've covered it here on the channel, let's examine what the new Intel Core Ultra 7 258V is capable of and see what Lunar Lake brings to the table. And just as a brief introduction, Intel's Lunar Lake is a significant step forward for Intel, which is part of a lineup of 9 different processors, which across the board all have 4 performance cores and 4 low power efficiency cores, with the same number of threads, and unlike Meteor Lake, promises to provide substantial improvements to performance at those lower wattages, making Lunar Lake a far more efficient chip compared to its predecessor, and certainly a very exciting proposition for a device like the MSI Claw. And when it comes to graphics, Intel has definitely made some bold claims for its new Arc 140V, which over Meteor Lake provides significant gains in the graphics department. So let's put those claims to the test with some synthetic numbers first, with Geekbench 6 and 3DMark's Time Spy, and then we will take a look at some gaming benchmarks to get a good feel of what to potentially expect before we dive into real-world gaming. Let's bring up the Geekbench 6 numbers first, and every test here was conducted using the MSI Claw's 30-watt manual TDP setting. Not only is this the max TDP that we can set here on the Claw 258V, but it's a TDP that we can set on other devices to make some comparisons against. The 258V came in with a single core score of 2,682, and a multi-core score of 10,412, now bringing in the first gen Claw with its Meteor Lake 155H, which scored 1,629 for the single core score and 9,282 for the multi-core score. We can definitely see that Lunar Lake, at least in terms of synthetic benchmarks, is ahead quite a bit over the 155H, with nearly a 65% increase on the single core score and about 12% on that multi-core score. Now bringing in some of the AMD options, I do have the Ally X lined up with its popular Z1 Xtreme, and a surprise here, the Zotac Zone, which actually does in fact exist, with the Ryzen 8840U, and numbers here are quite interesting, and we can see that in terms of the multi-core scores, the 258V is hanging around right there with the AMD counterparts, and in terms of single core performance, the 258V is offering the best numbers out of the group. So now let's pivot to a GPU test with 3DMark's Time Spy benchmark, and the 258V came in with an overall Time Spy score of 4,420, with the 155H in the first gen Claw coming in with an overall score of 3,488. Again, really highlighting the massive gains over the prior generation Meteor Lake with nearly a 27% increase over the 155H. And again, here are the AMD counterparts, which are all behind the 258V, and it does highlight a bit the graphics performance of the Arc 140V, but again, synthetic benchmarks only paint one picture. And we saw this with the 155H, which on paper is in line with the AMD options, but in real world performance, it was not so straightforward. which leads to our next round with the in-game benchmarks. And up first we have the Forza Horizon 5 benchmark, and Forza Horizon 5 is a really well optimized game that did surprisingly well with the first generation Claw, with the 135H and 155H as well, and was one of the better showcases for the Meteor Lake chipset in terms of its potential. So first on screen we have the second gen MSI Claw with its 250AV, and this one came in with an average of 80.2 frames per second, and then bringing in that 155H Claw, and you can see that this one wasn't too far behind, with an average of 71.2 frames per second, and so not too far behind the 250AV. Now let's bring in some of those AMD chips with the Ally X and the Z1 Xtreme, and this one came in with an average frames per second of 80.6, which is incredibly close to the MSI Claw 250AV. Now finally we have the Zotac Zone with the 8840U with an average frame rate of 85, and really when you look at all the numbers here, these are all pretty close to each other, and the same can be said when looking at those min-max numbers. But let's start to check out some other more demanding games, and here we have the Black Myth Wukong benchmark at that 30W preset again, using a resolution of 1080p, low preset, and the frame generation turned off. The 250AV came in with an average of 43 frames per second, and then the 155H behind with an average of 33 frames per second, which does represent about a 30% increase for the 250AV over the 155H, and is in line with some of the claims made by Intel for performance gains over Meteor Lake. Now let's look at the Z1 Xtreme, which had an average of 40 frames per second, and finally the 8840U, which is identical to the 250AV's 43 frames per second average. So let's bring in the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, set to use the 1920 by 1080 resolution, Direct 3D 12, and the low preset, with the 250AV scoring an average of 70 frames per second. And then the 155H, which came in with an average of 52 frames per second, and the first gen Claw was a solid performer with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but despite this, we can see that the 250AV is pulling quite ahead over the 155H with an appreciable 35% uptick over Meteor Lake. Now bringing in the AMD options, you can probably see what I mean by Meteor Lake being a decent performer with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, since both the Z1 Xtreme and 8840U only provide a few extra frames over the Meteor Lake option. But most importantly, I do think it's an impressive showing here for Lunar Lake, which clearly pulls ahead for this benchmark. Now let's round out the in-game benchmarks with one more test using Cyberpunk 2077 at the 30W TDP, using 1080p and the low preset, with the 250AV coming in with a 64.32 average frames per second, and then that 155H, which really falls behind, the 250AV coming in at just 41.29 average frames per second, and does represent a significant gain for Lunar Lake over Meteor Lake with almost a 56% increase in performance. And then we have the Z1 Xtreme with an average 55.12 frames per second, and finally the 8840U with an average of 52.75 frames per second, and it's another excellent showing here for the ARC 140V and Lunar Lake, giving it the best numbers here overall, and really a massive gain over Meteor Lake, which is exactly what we wanted to see here from Lunar Lake. And while we have Cyberpunk up, we might as well go ahead and do one last comparison point for fun. So let's take a quick look at how Lunar Lake and the Z1 Xtreme compare over different presets with 8 watts, 17 watts, and of course the 30W numbers that we just came from, to get a sense of how the two compare across different performance presets. We already know that the Claw at 30 watts with the 250AV hit an average of 64.32 frames per second, with the benchmark running using the default low settings and a resolution of 1080p. With the Z1 Xtreme averaging a 55.12 frames per second. Now dropping the TDP down to 70 watts, we can see that the two are very closely aligned, with the Claw hitting 46.46 frames per second, and the Z1 Xtreme hitting 47.77 frames per second. What's interesting here is that the Z1 Xtreme clearly is starting to see less of a performance gain coming from 17 watts to 30 watts, whereas the 250AV sees a much larger gain from that same preset. Now finally, at 8 watts, since this is a preset that can be set on both devices manually out of the box, the 250AV in the Claw averaged 24.14 frames per second, whereas the Z1 Xtreme managed just 13.51 frames per second. The performance scaling here is quite solid on the 250AV, and I think we'll be seeing quite a bit of that strong performance as we now shift on over and finally get into the good stuff and check out what this device was meant to do, and that's of course to play all of our PC games. And for this section, I wanted to highlight the MSI Claw at 2 different TDPs, since we can select between 8 watts, 17 watts, and 30 watts with the manual TDP option. I will be first highlighting a bit more demanding games, and then afterwards we will look at low TDP gaming, which I've done in the past for other devices, and highlight games that will do well at just the 8W setting. The 17W preset is going to be a nice in-between option for scenarios where you need a bit more of that power but are trying to be battery conscious, and in a little bit we will see what these presets mean for battery life on the MSI Claw 7 specifically. Finally, the 30W preset represents the upper end of performance here with the Lunar 258V, and it will allow us to showcase what it can do with that extra amount of power. So let's start out with a brand new release for PC, and Sony's Spider-Man 2 has finally made its way over to the PC world, and it's the sequel to both Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales, and is a continuation of both games, and certainly is going to be a nice demonstration of the capabilities of Intel's Lunar Lake chipset. And keep in mind that this game did just launch, and so it will without a doubt receive patches to improve performance in the future, but as it stands right now, this game is a surprisingly solid performer here with the MSI Claw and the 258V. And the beauty of modern games is that we have so many different ways to adjust settings, and what I'm showcasing here is just an example of some ways you can approach your configurations with a game like Spider-Man 2. And you've probably noticed that I have had Spider-Man 2 running in the background here using a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with Intel XeSS set to performance using low settings and a 30 frames per second cap at just the 17W preset. And while it's not absolutely stable, I'm pretty impressed by what we can get away with here at 17W. Now, keeping the same exact settings, but this time around let's go ahead and turn on frame generation as well as crank up the manual TDP preset to 30W, and with this we are able to stay at or above 60 frames per second with room to adjust settings based on personal preferences. Now let's check out another Sony port to PC with God of War Ragnarok, and I believe this is the first time that I'm actually featuring Ragnarok on the channel, as it's typically been just the prior game in the series. Now for God of War Ragnarok, I again tested both the 17W and 30W presets to get a sense of where we can land between the two settings, and much like we saw with Spider-Man 2, we do have similar scaling options and room to adjust settings as needed. At the 17W preset, I have Ragnarok set to use Intel XeSS to the Ultra Performance setting, with low settings, a resolution of 1920 by 1080, and a 30 frames per second cap with frame gen off, and it's doing quite well with these settings. Now if we switch to a 30W TDP preset and adjust settings a little bit with frame gen on, and then leaving the frame rate uncapped this time, we seem to be staying above 60 frames per second, and naturally it's going to be variable based on the area, but this again is quite similar to what we saw with Spider-Man 2, and I think this is really solid as well. Black Myth Wukong is another game that is quite demanding for a lot of these handhelds, and is an excellent way to really push Lunar Lake hardware so that we can see what it's capable of here. By the way, if you haven't tried out Black Myth Wukong, I highly recommend it, and it took me by surprise when it launched last year. So the same thing here for Black Myth. Let's first check out performance at the 17W preset using a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with Intel XeSS and a low graphics preset. And for this, I do have the frame rate uncapped to get a sense of the kind of room we have here with this game in terms of adjustments, which does seem to stay above 30 frames per second, but we are definitely pushing those ARC graphics quite hard here with these settings, and at times we do get some frame rate drops throughout gameplay. Now, if we adjust the TP again to 30W, we have obviously a bit more overhead to work with, and for this, I am using AMD FSR so that we can turn on the frame gen option. And we're still using the same resolution as well as low settings, and we can see that with frame gen as well as that extra amount of power, we are now mostly staying at 60 frames per second and at times going above that, which is pretty impressive given the game. And it's time to bring back a game that I featured last year multiple times with the Meteor Lake Core Ultra, since you may or may not remember that Alan Wake 2 was a good example of a game that had issues with the at the time Intel drivers. And so I really wanted to go back to Alan Wake 2 and see how things fare this time around with Lunar Lake, as well as check in and see if Intel addressed the issues with updated drivers. And I do have good news, since the game does appear to have been corrected and now works as expected with none of the weird graphical issues, and things like disabling global reflections doesn't cause any issues as well. And we might as well speak about the performance with Alan Wake 2, which I do have here running at 30W at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with AMD FSR2 set to ultra performance and low settings, and we are staying steady at the 30 frames per second cap that I've set here. This is a pretty demanding game for these handhelds, and so this is pretty solid to see. Alright, so let's now go in a completely opposite direction and showcase gaming with a lower TDP preset. And for the MSI Claw, we can go in and set a manual preset of just 8 watts, and I think the results here are quite impressive. First up, I've got Hades 2, which is still in early access and is the sequel to one of my favorite games ever. I tried to resist playing Hades 2 for as long as possible, but finally gave in a few months ago. And I have to say that I love everything about Hades 2, which as you can see here on the MSI Claw is quite the performer. At just the 8 watt preset, which results in generally about a 10 to 14 watt overall power consumption, is providing quite the experience with Hades 2. In fact, here we are set to use the native 1920 by 1080 resolution at high settings, and we are fully utilizing that 120Hz display with a fairly consistent 120 frames per second. And this is just incredible to me, and really does showcase what we can get away with on that lower preset. And another game that I recently discovered thanks to Xbox Game Pass and actually finally checked out was 9 Souls, which is an awesome Metroidvania style game that is set in this futuristic Asian inspired world and uniquely blends the mythology and sci-fi elements together. The hand-drawn art style is fantastic, the gameplay is solid, and it's one I highly recommend checking out, especially if you're an Xbox Game Pass member. 9 Souls is another great example of these kind of experiences that can be enjoyed at just 8 watts, and this one is another great performer with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 using low settings, and for this game it is certainly area dependent, but for the most part we are well above 60 frames per second, and depending on the area, we are oftentimes hitting that 120 frames per second target. This is another great use case of that excellent display with the VRR support, and so things will look smooth here regardless if we dip below 120 frames per second. And for a very new release, Tokyo Xtreme Racer has made a surprise return after almost 20 years of being absent, and I was pretty excited when I learned about this, and this is another game that is in early access, but in its current early access state is a ton of fun, especially if you remember this series from back in the day. I thought it would be fun to see if we can manage to get this game to run at just the 8 watt preset, and for this one I did go ahead and change the resolution to 1600 by 900 using low settings, which gets us pretty close to the 60 frames per second target that I was trying to achieve here, and I think that's pretty impressive with plenty of room to adjust even further if needed, but as it stands, this is awesome to see here with the Claw. So let's switch on over to the emulation side and check out performance with Lunar Lake, and right off the bat I have to say I am very impressed by what Lunar Lake is able to accomplish here. So let's just start out with some Nintendo Switch emulation using the latest build of the Citron emulator. We're going to continue to use that same 8 watt preset here for this testing. Yes, you heard that right, and I was pretty optimistic that the results were going to be very good on the emulation side based on my experiences so far with the Claw, and my optimism turned into reality, since the Claw performs quite well with just 8 watts using the Switch's native resolution and docked mode. Now I've had an awesome Switch exclusive, Golf Story, running in the background here, and naturally it's not the most demanding game, but let's check out another awesome Switch exclusive, 13 Sentinels, which likewise does very well here with the Citron emulator. And it's much of the same as I've ventured into the Switch library, checking out some of my other favorite exclusive games on the platform. Crash Team Racing Nitro Field is another game that runs incredibly well here with the Claw 8, using just 8 watts, docked mode, and this game isn't a Switch exclusive, but for whatever reason this game never received a PC port, and so the Switch version is one way we can enjoy this game on PC, and I absolutely love this remaster that I've now played many times in various ways, and the good news is if you're on the Claw with 258V, you will have an excellent experience here. Finally, let's really push this emulator to the limits of what we can achieve here with just the bare minimum of 8 watts with Tears of the Kingdom, and it's truly amazing that this is possible with just this preset. And I do have Tears running in handheld mode instead of dock mode, and the game naturally has a lot of shader compilation. But this is running quite well here, and very impressive to see. Tears is a game that also will smooth out quite a bit after some playtime because of that shader compilation, and natively does run at 20 frames per second outdoors. But the Claw is mostly able to maintain that using the manual 8 watt TDP that I've set here. Now, if we increase this to the 17 watt manual setting, we can see just how incredibly smooth this becomes. Now, this is exactly why I wish we had the ability to adjust on a per watt increment, since I think realistically if you were concerned with battery life and performance, a game like Tears will need just a little bit more than the 8 watts. But the nice thing is that it means we do have a lot of headroom on Lunar Lake, and to me at least is a great showcase of what's possible here. So let's check out the Sony side, and first up let's dive into some PlayStation 3 emulation with RPCS3. And let's go back to that 8 watt setting, which I think many games for RPCS3 will do well with. For example, I have Odin Sphere here, which is a fantastic game for Vanillaware that runs very well at the 8W preset, hitting a full 60 frames per second at the 1080p resolution. And then for games like Wipeout HD Fury, which is easily one of my favorite racing games ever made, we will need to bump things up a little bit since the 8W preset is just not quite enough to maintain the full 60 frames per second at the native 720p resolution. But at that 17W preset, the game runs incredibly well, and best of all, we can change the built-in resolution to 1080p and still hit the 60 frames per second target. And finally, let's check out some God of War 3, which is always a good benchmark of a harder to run game with RPCS 3. And for this one, I did my usual speed hacks, and I definitely recommend checking out my massive RPCS 3 showcase with the Ally X and the Z1 Xtreme, which covers settings and tips for 100 games on the PlayStation 3, and I think many of those settings and tips will translate well over here to the Lunar Lake chipset. Now here on the 258V, we are set to just 17 watts using all the speed hacks I mentioned with a frame cap of 30 frames per second, and this is a game that has a lot of shader compilation, but it does smooth out quite a bit. And we are for the most part able to play at 17 watts, and again, this is where manual adjustment out of the box would be nice to have. And one last console I just wanted to check out for fun. Here's some PlayStation 2 emulation with PCSX2, and this emulator to me is just incredible because nearly 2 decades later, and they are still constantly improving the emulation capabilities of PCSX2, and it definitely shows here, since on the Lunar Lake chipset, I am set to just an 8W preset with God of War 2, set to use 3 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution, which is the equivalent of 1080p, and the game does very well with this setting. And for a game that tends to have emulation issues, Sly 2 Band of Thieves also does mostly well at just 8 watts, with some minor dips in the most problematic areas, and for this you can just brute force by dropping the resolution, but it's still impressive to see at just an 8W TDP, using 3 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution. And for anyone that is looking to emulate the 6th generation like GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, Lunar Lake will do quite well with all of those consoles. And so after all of this gaming, what can we expect in terms of real-world battery performance with that 54.5 watt-hour battery? Let's start out with the lightest test here, and I've got God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2 using the PCSX2 emulator set to use 3 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, which is the equivalent of 1080p. I have the Claw set to use that manual 8W TDP preset at a 25% brightness, 25% volume, with the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RGB lighting all turned off, and with these settings, the Claw managed around 4 hours and 15 minutes of on-screen time. Now switching gears to a PC game, I'll use my usual game for my x86 test, with Returnal making a return here on the channel. For this test, I have the Claw now set to that 70W manual TDP preset with a 50% brightness, 50% volume, and the Wi-Fi and RGB lighting turned back on, but with the Bluetooth off, and in-game we are rocking a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with low settings, AMD FSR set to ultra performance, and you'll notice the game hovers in the 50s and 60s at time depending on the scene, which is awesome to see with this game at the 17W setting. And with all of this, the Claw managed to hit almost 2 hours of on-screen time, which means that give or take, we could probably see 2 hours if we turn things like Wi-Fi and the RGB lighting off. But honestly, this is where I was hoping we would be with that 17W preset, and it is quite solid despite the battery size. Finally, let's crank things up to 30 watts here, and with the same settings as before, except now we've got Returnal running at medium settings using AMD FSR set to balanced, and with that extra power, Returnal actually manages to stay right around the same amount of frames per second, and unsurprisingly at 30 watts, we're not going to get a whole lot of battery life here, hitting about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And I do apologize that I didn't realize the footage wasn't recording until right as it shut down the device. Now realistically, I think the 30W preset should be reserved for when you are plugged in, and I think most people, including myself, will try to target that 17W preset for the best balance between performance and battery life, and it's great to see that the Lunar Lake chipset is quite performant at those lower TDPs, which means we can squeeze more out of the 54.5 watt-hour battery. I really do wish that MSI had gone back and increased the battery capacity here, similar to what Asus did with the Ally X, and it's something that I've actually mentioned them in person, and hopefully they will consider it for the future. Now, if you are really wanting the most battery life, the Claw 8 will be the way to go with that 80 watt-hour battery. And finally, in terms of thermals, I found the device was always comfortable to handle, and the dual fans are certainly doing their job, but they still remain quiet, and the 8W preset, I recorded about 40 decibels, which is very quiet even with the audio very low, which is very quiet, and if I have the audio set to a very low setting, I don't really hear the fans. The same can be said when the power is turned up to 17 watts and the fans naturally will ramp up just a bit more, which I recorded at about 44 decibels with the auto fan setting at that 17 watt preset. I'd say that even with the volume very low, I don't really hear the fans running unless the room is absolutely silent. Now finally, at 30 watts, the auto preset will ramp up the fans a bit more than at that 17 watt setting, which is to be expected, but again, I don't think this is too loud, and while it is audible with the volume completely off, I'd say that at about 40% volume, the fans are really not noticeable at all. Regardless, I do find these to be quiet even when we have the Claw set to 30 watts, which I recorded at about 47 decibels. Now this is all just using the auto fan preset, which I actually think does an excellent job maintaining the thermals, and we can see that temperatures remain quite consistent across the 8 watt, 17 watt, and 30 watt presets, with the highest surface temperatures that I recorded at about 36 degrees Celsius on the display when using that 30 watt preset, but most importantly where your hands hold the device using the grips, as well as interacting with the controls, the device never really exceeded the mid to high 20s range regardless of the TDP preset, which is excellent, and again the handheld remains nice and cool with those fans doing the job, moving hot air away from the device as expected. So we've reached the end of this in-depth look at the new MSI Claw 7, and this second generation attempt with this specific model has really allowed MSI to claw back into the handheld space with improvements to the hardware itself, notably the Lunar chipset, which allows this handheld to not only hang out with the best of the bunch, but in many cases outperform what we've seen in the handheld space. In many ways, I really wish this was the Claw that we got last year. But as the saying goes, better late than never, and this go-around has proven to be much more fruitful for MSI. And I think the future is very promising since both Intel and MSI have proven that they are committed to improving the experience on both the software and hardware level based on the numerous updates that the first generation models received with tons of driver support. At its price point, it might be tough for some to be willing to drop the $799 for the Claw 7, but what you get here is about as top of the line as you can get right now in the handheld space when it comes to performance, and surprisingly the pricing is competitive when considering similar spec computers with that 258V chipset, and what you end up with is a powerful piece of hardware that can certainly be docked as an awesome productivity machine as well with those dual Thunderbolt 4 ports. At the end of the day, I'm just here to show you what can be done, and everyone's use case is going to be different, and only you can determine what is best for your needs. And on that note, I thank you for joining me on this journey discovering what the new Claw brings to the table, and I have a feeling I'll be back to showcase more of the Claw as well as the Lunar chipset in a future video. But until then, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.